During the years between 1934 and 1938, Austria was ruled by an authoritarian fascist regime heavily inspired and influenced by that of Mussolinis Italy. In historiography, this period is often overshadowed by the Anschluss and Austria's role within the Greater German Reich, and outside of Austria, the dictatorship is largely forgotten about. The following series attempts to give an explanation as to why the first Austrian democracy was dissolved, what life under this new system looked like, and how it came to an end 4 years later. This is the history of Austrofascism. The Austrian Republic was created as a result of the defeat in the First World War, and in the first few years of its existence, unrest among the population was a part of everyday life. Most of the country's industries were gone, and unemployment remained a huge issue. On top of that, divisions between the ruling parties began to show themselves. After the end of the ruling coalition between the Social Democrats and the Christian Social Party in 1920, the parliament was mostly ruled by bourgeois parties. Of course, there were massive divisions and disagreements between the bourgeois parties, but they all sort of shared a common ideological basis. They all, more or less, aimed at creating a Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, which had finally overcome the long-running class struggle between the workers and the capitalists, but not in the way Karl Marx had imagined it. Instead, this should be achieved by creating a corporate state, which is organized and divided into the different occupational groups. That way, both the workers and the employers were put into the same category, and thus unity between the workers should be shattered. Of course, there would be no parties and no democratically elected parliament. The idea of a corporate state had its roots in the late 19th century, but was heavily propagandized by the philosopher Ottmar Spann, who described the concept as a third way between Marxism and liberalism. Opposed to the bourgeois parties and their shenanigans were the Social Democrats, who became a significant player after 1918, especially in the bustling city of Vienna. They aimed for the liberation of the working class from their exploitative circumstances, for the creation of a socialist society, and for a democracy centered around the workers. So the economic positions and points of view between the Social Democrats and the bourgeois parties were fundamentally different and nigh impossible to overcome. While the former tried to improve the living conditions of the Austrian workers and did so to a considerable degree of success, the latter attempted to limit the power of the parliament and to give economic interest groups more power. But the fighting wasn't reserved to politicians in parliament. Many people, especially former soldiers who fought in the Great War, organised themselves into paramilitary groups, the Heimwehr. They weren't a party army like the SR was in Germany, but rather disorganised military associations with no central leadership. What united them was the fear of an apparent communist takeover and their hatred of social democracy. They were often financially supported by industrialists and the fascist regime in Italy. As a reaction to the Heimwehr, the Republikanischer Schutzbund was created, another paramilitary organisation with strong ties to the Social Democratic Party. Both of those groups often clashed on the streets, and brawls were an almost daily occurrence. On the 30th of January 1927, there was a bloody incident in the village of Schattendorf when some members of the Schutzbund walked into a pub, which was a well-known meeting place for the Heimwehr soldiers. At first, insults were exchanged between both groups, and then suddenly 3 Heimwehr members took out their guns and opened fire. A 6-year-old boy and a disabled Croatian war veteran were killed. The murderers were tried and quickly absolved of their crimes by an obviously politically influenced court. This sparked a wave of outrage among the Social Democrats, and on the 15th of July mass demonstrations were held in Vienna. The police were sent out on their horses, which only angered the protesters, who then proceeded to storm the Palace of Justice and set it on fire. The firemen were not able to reach the fire through the angry masses, and so the police chief, Johann Schober, ordered that the policemen should open fire to drive away the protesters. About 90 people were killed, and hundreds more got hurt by the police on that day. The events, the ever-increasing instability, and the growing influence of the Social Democrats after the bloody Vienna protests were deeply concerning to the bourgeois parties, who were only barely able to cling onto their majority in the parliament. Voices calling for a more central and a more authoritarian rule were starting to make themselves heard. The suggestion was that the constitution should be rewritten to fit an authoritarian way of rule, but that required a 66% majority in the parliament, so the Social Democratic Party had to agree as well. It came to a compromise which granted the president a lot more powers, such as command over the army and the power to dissolve the parliament. For now, at least, the parliamentary system was saved, but the stock market crash in New York only exacerbated the political instability. Worker salaries decreased, unemployment skyrocketed, and the social system was struggling to keep itself afloat. Because of that, the bourgeois milieu began to radicalize itself. The parliamentary system was put into question, and whether or not it was suitable for solving the current crisis. Many people from all layers of society developed the idea that a complete dissolution of the Austrian Republic was the only way to go forward. Kurt Schuschnigg, who would soon become the Minister of Justice, said the following in a ministerial council meeting in June of 1932. The parliaments of all states in economic distress have proved unsuitable to lead the state and the people out of the crisis. The government is therefore faced with the decision of whether it can continue to work with the parliament or whether the next change of cabinet should not be tantamount to the elimination of parliament. In such a state of emergency, governing with parliament is not possible. As if that wasn't bad enough, the paramilitary forces also began to show a very limited understanding towards the continued existence of the Republic. The Tyrolean Heimwehr leader, Richard Steidle, wanted to unify the heterogeneous and spread out Heimwehr organizations into a single unified paramilitary force. He also wanted to stress their independence from the Christian Social Party, which they were often associated with. In the town of Korneuburg, the Heimwehr leaders from all over Austria met in May of 1930 in order to pledge their allegiance to a clearly defined course of action. To summarize and to quote a few points from their list of demands: "We want to grab power in the state and reorganize the state and the economy for the good of the entire people. We reject Western democratic parliamentarism and the party state. We fight against the decomposition of our people by the Marxist class struggle and liberal capitalist economic organization." The Styrian Heimwehr leader, Dr. Walter Pfriemer, openly declared that only fascism could save Austria. Shortly before the parliamentary elections of 1930, and with direct and open support from Benito Mussolini, the Heimwehr decided that it should send its own members to the parliament as part of the newly formed Heimatblock party. The election of 1930 turned out to be a disaster for the bourgeois parties. The Social Democrats became the strongest power, and the Christian Social Party fell behind vastly. On top of that, the Austrian NSDAP managed to expand their voter base, even though the party never became as popular as it did in Germany. The bourgeois were losing more power, and were now ruling with a tiny majority. In March, a relatively unknown man named Engelbert Dollfuss became the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry. As if the political situation wasn't difficult enough already, the bankruptcy of Austria's largest bank, the Kreditanstalt, added economic issues on an unprecedented scale. As the bank was very heavily intertwined with Austrian industries and other smaller banks, the government saw itself forced to bail it out. That, however, could only be achieved with foreign loans, which made Austria even more dependent on foreign capital than it already had been. In total, about 840 million shilling of largely taxpayers' money were needed to somewhat salvage the Kreditanstalt, and Austria's already unstable economy essentially came to a complete halt. But still, this economic crisis didn't trigger a shift to the right like it did in some other countries. The Social Democrats still had a huge power base, the openly fascist Heimwehr only had a small number of seats in the parliament, and even the number of violent clashes went back. To the Styrian Heimwehr leader, Walter Pfriemer, this era of relative calmness was unacceptable. The previous strategy of seizing power by parliamentary means had failed, so more radical means had to be employed. On the 12th of September 1931, he mobilized 14,000 armed men all over Styria and ordered them to occupy various cities in the region and to proclaim that Pfriemer was now taking over the government in a heroic march on Vienna. But this never happened, as already on the next day, the other Heimwehr leaders vocally disapproved of the attempted coup, and the Austrian army stopped the insurgents without much resistance. Walter Pfriemer fled to Yugoslavia, but later handed himself in. The court in Graz ruled him and everyone else responsible innocent, which made it clear to many on the left that they could expect nothing from the judicial system. When the National Socialists managed to gain more votes in the state elections in Vienna, Lower Austria and Salzburg, the government resigned and had to somehow reform itself. For the Christian Social Party, it was unacceptable to form a coalition with the Social Democrats, or the Greater German Party, so they partnered up with the openly fascist and anti-parliamentarian Heimwehr Party, because it seemed like their goals actually overlapped quite nicely. The aforementioned Engelbert Dollfuss became the new Chancellor, and Kurt Schuschnigg became the Minister of Justice. At that point in time, Austria still urgently needed foreign money to sustain itself. In Lausanne, the League of Nations granted Austria 300 million shilling, but not for free, of course. In exchange for the money, the government had to pledge complete neutrality and promise not to unite with Germany. The loan wasn't enough, however, to overcome the crisis, so austerity measures and an increase in taxes would have had to be introduced, which would hit those with a lower income especially hard. Because of the projected economic problems and because of the Anschluss clause, both the Social Democrats and the Greater German Party strictly opposed the bill. In the end, the loan was approved by the parliament with a majority of just 2 votes. Dollfuss realized that if things went on like that, he and the Christian Socials would soon lose all control over the government. So if he wanted to fulfill his ambitions, he would have to deprive the opposition of their political power and establish an authoritarian regime. But how exactly does one go about this? Dollfuss's constitutional expert discovered an interesting law from 1917, the so-called Kriegswirtschaftliches Ermächtigungsgesetz, which allowed the government to make decisions without the parliament's approval. Interesting. Of course, the law had become redundant in 1918 when the empire collapsed, but it had never been formally abolished. And Dollfuss wouldn't have to wait long to use his newly discovered power. In January of 1933, Austrian railway workers discovered 40 train wagons loaded with illegally smuggled weapons from Italy. Mussolini had planned to further arm the Heimwehr and to support his Hungarian allies. This caused an international outrage from Britain and France especially, and it temporarily embarrassed the Dollfuss government. Under international pressure, Mussolini caved in and agreed to take the weapons back. But it doesn't end there. It turns out that the general director of the Austrian Railways attempted to bribe the head of the Railway Workers' Union and to convince him to only pretend that the train would be sent home, when in fact it should instead be sent on its way to Hungary. The head of the union refused and the whole affair went public. When it was almost simultaneously announced that railway worker salaries would from now on only be paid in rates, a nationwide strike was called on the 1st of March. Dollfuss decided to use, or rather abuse, the Ermächtigungsgesetz from World War I to crack down on the strikers. Their salaries were cut, many of their leaders were fired, and some were even arrested. When the Social Democratic Party and the Greater Germans protested and it came to no agreement, all 3 presidents of the parliament resigned and the session was delayed. This was a perfect opportunity for Dollfuss to finally get rid of parliamentary control and to secure bourgeois dominance. Once again using the Ermächtigungsgesetz, he heavily restricted the freedom of the press and criminalized all sorts of political assemblies. He was supported by his coalition parties and by representatives from the industry and from the agricultural sector. The Austrian president, Wilhelm Miklas, never did anything to seriously hinder the authoritarian course the government was taking. When the opposition tried to enter the parliament on the 15th of March, they were chased off by the police. A few days later, Dollfuss publicly proclaimed to the Austrian people that certain parts of the constitution were no longer valid, that the parliamentary system was abolished, and that from now on the ministers and Dollfuss would rule solely. And that's how the Austrian parliament was eliminated within a matter of days. It was a perfect example of what a coup from above actually looks like. What's remarkable is that unlike Germany's National Socialists, Dollfuss and those surrounding him never attempted to appear legitimate when taking power. Still, however, Dollfuss needed allies. Germany was out of the question because it waged an economic war and encouraged Austrian National Socialists to partake in terrorist activities in order to destabilize the new regime. Italy, on the other hand, seemed to be the most sensible option. Mussolini and Dollfuss met a number of times in 1933, and during those meetings Il Duce pressed the Austrian dictator into getting rid of the social democratic opposition, and into writing a new Austro-Fascist constitution. In May, 1 week after Dollfuss had founded his own new party, the Vaterländische Front, he banned the Austrian Communist Party, and just 1 month later, after numerous terror attacks, the NSDAP was made illegal as well. In September, Dollfuss then dissolved the Constitutional Court in Vienna and founded a number of detention camps where mostly communists, social democrats and other political enemies were imprisoned. 1 month later, the Minister for Justice, Schuschnigg, partially reintroduced both martial law and the death sentence for certain crimes such as murder, arson and so on. In February of 1934, under even more pressure from Mussolini, the government decided to finally crack down on the Social Democrats. It came to mass arrests and to searchings of party headquarters. In Linz, the Social Democrats resisted the police entering their headquarters, and soon after, fire was exchanged. The uprising quickly spread to other industrialized cities like Vienna or Steyr, but it was an unfair fight from the very start. The planned general strike was only partially followed up on, and extremely ineffective. On top of that, the insurgents were restricted to only a few areas of Austria, and were left to their own devices due to the lack of a centralized command. So, against the army, the paramilitary forces and the police, the Social Democrats stood no chance, and just a few days later, the Austrian Civil War was over, and 350 people were dead. The Social Democratic leadership fled over the Czechoslovak border, their party was promptly made illegal, and some of the insurgents were executed. With all of the opposing parties dealt with, it was time for Dollfuss to draw up his new political system. In a speech in September 1933, he had declared the following: "The time of party rule is over. We want the social, Christian, German state of Austria on a corporate basis under strong authoritarian leadership." He applied those ideals in the new May Constitution in May of 1934. In it, he completely transferred the process of passing laws into the hands of the government, or rather himself, and gave the Chancellor, again himself, even more powers. All elections were abolished, this goes without saying. Press freedom was completely abolished, with serious punishments awaiting those who dared to speak up. It was made impossible for workers to defend themselves against their employers, as unions were completely banned as well. The very first article of the Constitution was changed from "Austria is a democratic republic. The law emanates from the people," to "In the name of God, the Almighty, from whom all law proceeds, the Austrian people receive this constitution for their Christian German federal state, on the basis of cooperative principles." The parliament, or what was left of it, was called into session one final time, with only one single task: to ratify this new constitution and to bury any democratic remnant that Austria still possessed. It was accepted with 74 to 2 votes, and the new fascist total rulers made it abundantly clear that this was no temporary solution. Alright then, Dankeschön for watching the video, and I hope you've learned something. A very special and grateful thanks goes out to A Cup of Tea and James for their generous support over on Ko-Fi. You are phenomenal. Have a very wonderful day, and see you next time.